I think we're about ready to roll. My name is Colin Delaney. I'm with epolitics.com. I'm very excited to be joining you guys. And I am joined today by an expert on the question of nonprofits in an election year, attorney Jean Kortenbrock, who's joining us from Michigan. I'm also joined by Albert the ePolitics cat, who will probably interject periodically into the conversation when I'm talking. So that's who's joining me here. So what we're going to do is a very quick intro. Then Jean is going to spend the first part of the session talking about the legal framework. And then I'll dive into the second part to talk about some things that basically considerations that nonprofit communication staff and grassroots staff should keep in mind in the election year, and then some tactics for engaging your followers within the guidelines. But why don't I go ahead and kick it over to Jean for the first part of our session.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean Kortenbrock, and I just recently joined Fraser Bilcock here in Lansing, Michigan, which is our state's capital. I've been working with campaign finance, election law, and nonprofits for about 20 years. And I had the opportunity to meet Colin last fall at a conference that we were at, and we decided to collaborate on these, and we hope to bring you a few more of them. So if you like it and you want to share the information, our contact information, we can make sure other people get on for the next one.
Oh, and just one quick note, we will be recording this, so let's make sure the recording's on, and then we'll post this afterwards. We'll send a follow-up email with more information. So, so we're not going to leave you guys without anything to take away. My mom always said, leave folks with something to take home with them. So we'll send a recording and any other resources after the fact.
All right. Now, Colin, you need to cancel your screen share.
I should have.
Okay. So now I do it.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah. All right. So I get the dry topic today, the legal topic, but I'm sure you'll have questions. And we're going to say, I don't know if you mentioned this, but we're going to save our questions until the end. The very first thing, though, we're going to cover generally which nonprofits are able to engage in political activity. To a degree, all of them are. However, 501c3s and labor organizations are the most limited under the law. So 501c3s can only engage in nonpartisan voter registration and voter engagement. And I put a little list together of some examples of voter engagement that would be permissible under the IRS guidelines and regulations. The social welfare organizations are typically the organizations that are running the issue advocacy campaigns that you're seeing on television and hearing on the radio. But the labor organizations can still participate, they just cannot engage in what's called electioneering communications. And so I'm going to distinguish exactly what is an electioneering communication in just a moment. So that's not to say that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act completely prohibits labor organizations from engaging in issue advocacy. It just cannot fall into this bucket that is defined as electioneering communications. So the IRS considers political activity any activity that qualifies as an exempt function under 520(7)(e)(2). They're going to look at all the facts and circumstances to determine whether an expenditure for an advocacy communication relating to a public policy issue is for an exempt function. When an advocacy communication explicitly advocates the election or defeat of an individual to public office, the expenditure clearly is for an exempt function under the section. However, when an advocacy communication relating to a public policy issue does not explicitly advocate the election or defeat of a candidate, All the facts and circumstances will be considered to determine whether the expenditure is for an exempt function. They look at 6 different factors. The communication, whether the communication identifies a candidate for public office, the timing of the communication, and whether it coincides with an electoral campaign, whether the communication targets voters in a particular election, whether the communication identifies that candidate's position on the public policy issue that is the subject of the communication, and whether the position of the candidate or the public policy issue that's been raised in the communication distinguishes the candidate from others in the campaign. And lastly, the communication is not part of an ongoing series of substantially similar advocacy communications by the organization on the same issue. If any of those 6 factors are absent, or if the communication identifies specific legislation or a specific event outside the control of the organization that the organization hopes to influence, the IRS is not going to consider this political activity. In addition, the timing of the communication and whether it coincides with a specific event outside the control of the organization that the organization hopes to influence, and that would be such as a legislative vote or other major legislative action like a hearing before a committee on an issue that's the subject of the communication. This won't be considered political activity. If the communication identifies the individual solely as a government official who is in a position to act on a public policy issue in connection with the specific event, and this would be like a legislator who's eligible to vote on the legislation, it won't be considered political activity. And finally, if the communication identifies the candidate solely in the list of key or principal sponsors of legislation that is the subject of the organization's communication, it won't be considered political activity. Now, if the nonprofits didn't have enough to worry about having to report their activities on their tax returns to the IRS, you also need to be aware that there may be election reporting with the FEC. There's quite a bit of guidance on the FEC.gov website. However, generally, the electioneering communications are those that have a clearly defined candidate identified in them. If the advertising does not expressly say the candidate's name or say any reference to the candidate's last name, then it will not be electioneering communication that needs to be regulated by the FEC. When a communication is aired, broadcast, cablecast, or otherwise disseminated through the facilities or a radio television station or a cable television system or a satellite system, the rules governing electioneering communications apply. Mass communications via the internet or mail, these don't apply. And so you would not need to file any report, no matter what time you sent them out prior to a primary or general election. It's only specifically for advertising that's considered broadcast advertising. When a communication is received by 50,000 or more people in a candidate's district for a House candidate or within a state for a Senate candidate, or for presidential or vice presidential elections right before a primary or general in any state, within 30 days of that primary or 60 days of a general election, that communication will be considered electioneering communication. So, trying to distinguish that fine line between what is and what is not in electioneering communication can sometimes be very difficult. The Federal Elections Commission will look to see whether the communication is publicly disseminated through means other than broadcast cable or satellite media, like I just mentioned, but also whether the communication appears in a news story, commentary, or editorial, publicly distributed by a news outlet, essentially, and not controlled by any political party or candidate. It will not be considered electioneering. If the communication is a bona fide news story distributed by facilities owned and controlled by a political party or a political committee or candidate, it's not going to be considered an electioneering communication. Any expenditure or independent expenditure that is regulated by the Federal Elections Commission for political committees and meets that definition does not fall into electioneering communication requirements. And if the communication constitutes a candidate debate or a forum or a promotion of the debate or any other type of forum or sponsor of an event, that's not an electioneering communication. And if it is paid for by a candidate for a non-federal office in connection with a non-federal election, it's not considered electioneering, provided that the communication does not promote, support, attack, or oppose any federal candidate. Electioneering communications also require certain disclaimers that you need to be aware of. We've all heard the disclaimers. I've laid out what the requirements are here for you. The disclaimer notice has to identify who paid for it and indicate whether any candidate or candidates committee authorized the communication. This notice must contain the full name of the individual or group or organization that paid for the communication, along with any abbreviated name that it uses to identify itself. It has to provide an address or just a point of contact, such as a telephone number or website address. And then, of course, you need to indicate whether or not it was authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And this disclaimer needs to be clear and conspicuous. Disclaimer is not clear and conspicuous if it is difficult to read or easily overlooked within the medium in which the communication is transmitted. The electioneering communications activity needs to be reported on a Form 9 with the FEC. This can be filed electronically or it can be filed on paper and needs to be received by the Federal Elections Commission within 24 hours of the disclosure. And this is only for communications that aggregate over $10,000 in a calendar year. Every time a new disbursement is made from the funds of the organization to communicate the message, a new Form 9 has to be submitted. So if you have made an expenditure 60 days out from the general election and you run the ad only Monday through Friday, but you paid for the entire month of September, each week in September, you don't need to file a new Form 9 because you're running the ad again and you stopped it over the weekend. It's only when the disbursement's made.
And Jean, a quick question from Colin. What is a good example? You mentioned ads. What are some other examples of specific activities that might trigger this?
It's only the broadcast ads, so it includes radio and television. Satellite buys I would imagine both for satellite radio and for satellite television. It does not cover any. It's kind of funny that it's almost as if the law hasn't really caught up with what is actually happening out there. But your Google ads, your other digital ads, your Facebook ads, any print. I'll give you an example. So a labor organization, they're prohibited from electioneering communications at all. However, they can still take out newspaper ads 60 days out from general election or 30 days out from a primary. So it's really just those broadcast ads that you need to be worried about. Any other questions that can come up?
Not right now.
Okay, we can take some more at the end then.
Oh, okay, you're wrapped up. Yeah. Okay, so no, great. This is Colin again. I just have wanted to follow up with a couple of quick things. What are some of the big mistakes that you see nonprofits make around election time, or in an election season? Whether mistakes like going too far or not going far enough.
Well, so when the problem that you run into, and here in Michigan, we have a really fine, a very bright line of express advocacy and what that is. However, the Federal Elections Commission and the IRS both look at all the language. And if someone was reading or hearing an ad or watching an ad on TV, whether they would be inclined to think that the organization was telling them to actually go vote. So they might not use the word vote. They might not use the word support. But if the advertisement crosses that line to the point where an average person or a reasonable person would believe that the ad was telling them to go support that person, you may be in jeopardy of getting fined with the IRS or the FEC for not filing your Form 9. Does that make sense? And I know you're going to talk probably a little bit more about that. But the language is very, very, very important. Okay.
No, that's very good to know. And so as we're going into the section that I'm going to handle, which is talking more about more about what campaigns can do, basically from a messaging and communications and engagement point of view. Jean, if I say anything wrong, please jump in, okay?
Yeah, definitely. There was one other thing that I'll mention with regard to nonprofits. The primary activity of the organization cannot be the issue advocacy when it is considered political activity. Not the issue advocacy for anything that's not considered political activity. But I've just, it's been very, I've noticed a lot of organizations that have been developed that put 100% of their eggs in that basket. And that's something the IRS will look at when determining whether to continue a tax system status.
I see. So the question, you can't be a 501c3 that's just set up to try to influence elections openly.
Yeah,
right. That would be bad.
Yeah. Well, and then they can't influence elections anyway. But like the voter registration and that, they're yeah. So there are some things that you have to watch for as far as percentages.
I see. So I could, for instance, go out to register low-income voters in a given area, but I couldn't go out to register specifically Democrats and Democrats only.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Now, very cool. Thanks for helping with that. Yeah. Now,
no
if you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No problem. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. And then you can pick up where I left off.
I will click share screen. Yep. And here we go. And can you see my screen now?
Nope.
Well, I pushed the wrong button then, that's why.
Go to the very bottom of your screen.
And there it is.
Your screen button.
Yes, no, just the problem is finding the PowerPoint. There it is. Okay, can you guys see that now?
Now I got it.
Okay, great. Let me get out of this editing pane and go to full screen. All right, well, good deal. Well, thanks, Gene, very much. I really appreciate it. That's very, very helpful. And I just want to point out that if you guys are in DC, I'm helping to co-organize a Net Squared meetup next week on Wednesday at the WeWork Wonder Bread in Shaw. And trying to get a couple of folks from nonprofits that deal with these issues, and we'll sit down and have a big kind of roundtable discussion about the challenges and the opportunities. So, and like I said earlier, we'll be sending around a copy of this recording, a link to it. And obviously, we encourage you to follow up with us with your questions. So, so this is me. I'm Colin Delaney. I've been in the digital political world for over 20 years. I've been in the political world for close to 30 years, starting back as a staffer in the Texas legislature when I was a tiny, tiny young man. These days, I work as a digital strategy consultant with a variety of nonprofits and political organizations. I'm an advocate myself. I write about digital politics and advocacy at ePolitics. I have an ebook that the 2020 edition will be out soon. And as another freebie, I'll give you guys a discount code to get it half price when it comes out. And then I occasionally play bass in rock and roll bands. So if you need a bassist, let me know. All right, let's dive in here. So, election year. Obstacles. Obviously, nobody's talking about our stuff, right? The media environment is extremely crowded. It's very difficult for an organization to try to break through on purpose. It's also a very crowded fundraising environment, and it's a crowded advertising environment. I was running a campaign for Save the Children that targeted some early voting states. And by the way, it was a 501c4 expenditure, so they were able to do that and expressly mention the presidential race. But our advertising rates went up by easily 50 or 100% between October and the end of November last year because Tom Steyer jumped in, and then of course Bloomberg followed up. So just beware that the social media and other digital ad environments going to be crowded. So our issues get lost in the clutter, except when they pop up unexpectedly, right? And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is how to get ready for those moments where things do pop up. And of course, you know, we're not the only ones who are competing for our supporters' attentions and for their dollars. So how do we try to make things happen in an election year? So there are some opportunities, right? People are going to be totally fired up, especially with as much on the line as there is on the line this year. So much of what I'm going to talk about is how, or discuss ways to try to tap into that kind of enthusiasm and channel it toward your own organization's policy goals. So what do you want to prepare for? One, you might try to raise the profile of your issues yourselves, and you want to get ready for the, one, try to go out and get media attention, but also to capitalize on any media attention that comes in unexpectedly. You want to prepare for fundraising, looking for realistic opportunities and also realistic goals. And we'll talk a little more about goals in a minute, but just be one quick pro tip. Don't send fundraisers at the end of the month, or certainly not at the end of the quarter if you want them to perform well, unless they're tied to some real hook in the news. It's just that every campaign on earth is going to be trying to hit those monthly deadlines. They have to report numbers, and they want to report big numbers. So, January 31st, my inbox was full. And I think we can expect the same sort of thing all the way through the end of October. Also prepare for trying to build support, trying to capture that enthusiasm and channel it toward the long-term goals of your org. You may be building capacity internally, learning how to do things, bringing in people with different skills, and also building resources that you'll be able to use in future years. And then, of course, Congress is still meeting, state legislators are still meeting, federal and state agencies are still doing their jobs. So advocacy, even in an election year, does not go away. So how do we get ready? And just remember, we'll take some more questions at the end of the session. So first, I want to talk about getting your organization itself ready. If you have to wait 2 days to have a tweet approved by the executive director, you're not going to be able to respond rapidly, right? So it's really important before you need buy-in from your senior leadership, obviously, but also from the staff who may be helping you, prepare these materials on the run, issue experts, your digital staff, if you're not in digital, your communications staff, if you're not in communications, but basically getting people on board and helping them understand the speed with which you may have to make decisions. And also the thing to get, buy-in on early is this idea of clear and reasonable goals. What's your goal? Do we want to try to build our email list by 100,000 in targeted states? Do we want to build our Facebook following by a certain amount? Do we want to spark a certain number of supporter actions on social media? Do we want to get views for our videos? Do we want to get petition signatures to actually deliver to a decision maker, even in an election year? So understand those goals and then create a serious, detailed strategy document to get there. But I cannot overemphasize the importance of getting ready before you need to be ready. Have all of your content, your photos, story banking, any data that supports your advocacy, infographics to illustrate that data, sample action alerts and other emails to your supporters, social media content, obviously. If you have to go hunting for a photograph when CNN just covered your issue for the first time, that's bad. You want to have that photograph ready. And also issue text. Don't forget text. Policy positions, things that communication staff can just copy and paste and put into a tweet, a Facebook post, an email, an online video, whatever it is. And besides content, you also want to prepare those relationships. I often talk about how organizations that are good at, organizations don't necessarily have to be good at everything, right? I've worked, for instance, I was in-house at National Women's Law Center for a couple of years, and they were a heavily policy-focused organization, really the policy experts around their subjects. But we didn't have a grassroots presence. We didn't have, supporters on the ground, organizing teams out in the States. Our own email list was not huge. Our social media following was not huge. So what we would do frequently was to create good content and then rely on our allies to share it. But of course, they were going to share it because we already had relationships with them and they trusted us and they knew that our content was going to have every I dotted and every T crossed. So besides allies, think about journalists you need to connect with now, bloggers who write about your field, other online activists and influencers. I'm talking to a group right now that's working with trying to work with celebrities and entertainers to go back to their home districts to try to fire people up around the issues. So, but if you try to do that last second, obviously you're not going to get to J-Lo, right? So again, build those relationships before you need them. And then, okay, so let's talk about the things we're going to do. So we're going to talk about getting media attention. We're going to talk about grassroots engagement. We're going to talk about fundraising. Let's start with the media. So the rule number one is you have to be relevant to what's happening. Sometimes it's obvious, but a lot of times we have to create it. I was working this summer with the National Whistleblower Center. And soon after I got done helping them set up their, online strategy for the next couple of years, the Ukraine CIA whistleblower suddenly got the concept of whistleblowing very high on the national radar. And because this organization already had relationships with the reporters who were interested in whistleblowing as a concept and, the kinds of protections that whistleblowers have under the law, this organization was able to get into Washington Post and other stories talking about whistleblowing, and it was central to their mission, obviously. So it wasn't like they were, trying to attach themselves to something that wasn't relevant. Now that is the great example. More often we're going to try to build relevance, and I'll talk a little bit about something I did with Save the Children and a little bit about that. But again, prepare the content before you need it, and also anticipate those possible media hooks. And if something is getting talked about, as part of the presidential or other campaigns, if the media is talking about it, look for ways to hook it to your issue. Look for stories from your supporters or data or some way you can connect yourself to that story. But you got to move fast. That reporter might be filing in an hour. So in air combat, they talk about, the old line is speed is life. And the same thing is true in rapid response. So when the moment strikes, get your message out as fast as you can. I used to work at a fast-moving environmental group, and frequently we would get word about something at 9:45 in the morning, and our press people would be on the phone with reporters by 10:15. We would have a statement out on the website by 10:20, and our lobbyists were headed to the Hill 10 minutes later. So you've got to get out fast. Work the reporters, bloggers, and online influencers, particularly the ones with whom you've already built relationships. But then mobilize your supporters. I think too often we tend to neglect the power of our supporters to be messaging hubs within their own social and public circles. So give them the information they need to make the case for your issue and your perspective on that issue, and why it's important at a moment when people may be talking about it. Also, flood your content channels. And by this, I mean blogs, social media, certainly YouTube if you can do it. And then, of course, news section of your website, allies, of course, anything you can get into. But the reason I mention YouTube is a lot of groups don't do this, but getting one of your issue experts on for 30 seconds or a minute. YouTube is functionally the second most popular search engine in the US nowadays. So if you can get a properly tagged and titled video up there, it may reach an audience of people who are searching for information on that topic because they heard about it on the news. And likewise, I don't think we need to worry about voice search quite yet, but that'll be a consideration. It already is a consideration for political campaigns, and it'll be a consideration for us too. Never hurts to have a frequently asked questions about your issue on your website. Alexa and Siri tend to pick up on that kind of content that looks like it is neutral and not part of our ongoing propaganda efforts. Also think about online advertising. If there are particular audiences you need to reach, I'm very frustrated that Twitter got rid of political promoted tweets because they were a useful tool for trying to catch the eye of opinion leaders and journalists, elected officials themselves. But Twitter chose to cop out and not live up to the responsibilities that their central role in our communications requires, I would argue. But that's a story for another day. But think about online advertising. Banner ads, display ads, Facebook ads. As I said earlier, the inventory will be tight in most places. So think about niche audiences you could try to reach. And again, how can you get into the minds of the decision makers and the opinion leaders? So let's talk about engaging our supporters. So if they haven't heard from you in 6 months and you suddenly want them to do something, they're probably going to go, huh? Right? So through the course of the year, you want to think in terms of a stream of content through different channels. Obviously, action alerts, issue updates, but things like polls and quizzes that give your followers and your supporters the opportunity to express themselves and feel like they're actually a part of the process. And if you're going to do a poll, at least do something with the results.
Colin, sounds like we lost Colin. Well, it sounds like we lost Colin. I'm not sure if this is due to his screen. I'm going to go ahead and text him. While we're waiting for Colin to get back on, let me see if I can unmute his thing, which says that he's on. It must be his computer, everybody. I apologize for that. Well, there you go. I'm going to go ahead and answer any questions that you may have at the moment. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Hey.
Okay.
Yeah. Technology kids. Zoom decided to kill off my connection, but thanks to having the information close at hand, I was able to get back on. So talk about being prepared. So can you guys still see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. So I'm not quite sure where I got cut off. I'll just jump in with share asks, asking people to share content on social media. By the way, if you really want to get something shared on social media, send your supporters an email about it with a one-click share link. Cross-channel promotion like that can be more effective than try to push something out on Facebook itself. Also asking people to create content, upload their videos. The ever popular hold up a sign with a hashtag or a phrase, and then encourage people to post it to their own social channels and use the hashtag so you can aggregate it later. Giving people a chance to really feel like they're doing something and feel like they're being involved, between now and the point they can actually cast a ballot. And then other opportunities to show solidarity. The marriage equality screenshot I have there was from a I forget which organization did it, probably HRC, but I'm not sure. But it was basically, this was a quick overlay that people could use to create their screenshot, their headshot, profile picture, there you go, on Facebook. So, and you've seen this kind of thing take off for many, many different organizations. And again, it's a way for people to one, feel affiliated and feel connected, and two, actually make the case to show the broader public that people care about this issue. And here are a couple of quick examples of engaging supporters. The one on the left is a project I worked on with Save the Children. We were doing a petition sign up, and they the plan is to turn this into media opportunities to have the petition signatures printed out on the equivalent of one of those big fake checks they give you when you win the Publishers Clearinghouse, but rather give it to the candidates and turn that into a media appearance. So we used targeted Facebook advertising, lead generation ads to get petition signatures that then the people who signed the petition obviously end up on the organization's list if they opt in. But then the second part is creating a media opportunity. And then on the right, there's an example from the League of Conservation Voters from 2016. Again, a petition signature. Those are great list building opportunities. So advocacy. Congress is not going to be getting a whole lot done this year, I suspect, but look for state or local level opportunities or federal or state regulatory agencies. Look at ways to get your advocates up and active, even if Congress isn't going to do anything on their issues. Obviously, tie asks to events in the news whenever you can. Just give people the opportunity to act. Give them an outlet. I think talking to Democrats around the country, that the amount of tension is so high, people wanting to be able to do something, wanting to get some kind of resolution, that I think that you can, one, help your own organization, but you can also help people psychologically by giving them something to do. So let's move on to fundraising real quick. I know time's beginning to get tight here. So it is tricky because of the volume. So whenever possible, obviously make it relevant to things that are in the news or that people care about. Grab the opportunities when they come. Take a shot at something that's a fleeting opportunity. You might only have a day, but if it's in the news, get out, get your fundraising, ask out. Explain why, make the connection to the broader issues. Be as specific as you can typically. I mean, these are all just sort of the general rules of thumb, but be realistic. The $5 someone donates to you is probably not going to, affect the orbit of the earth, right? But, and in the long run, if you promise too much, I think that your supporters, your response rates can go down as your supporters kind of you start to realize that you're faking it, right? So be specific, be realistic, and explain how somebody's donation can make a real difference in the world. So building capacity, this is a great opportunity for nonprofits in a lot of different fields. So we've talked a little bit about list building so far through online petitions, which you can distribute via social media, but there's also paid acquisition. The project I mentioned for Save the Children used Facebook lead generation ads. You can also look at paid petitions on, sites like care2.com or care2.org. Again, people are fired up. Give them something to do, and you can build your support over the long term. You can also look at opportunities for joint actions when 2 organizations or 3 organizations create a petition or some other action together, and each of them grows its list. Similarly, you can do a list swap, and by that I don't mean hand your email list over to the other person or the opposite, but perhaps each of you sends out a message to your own list promoting the other organization's action. Of course, it needs to be an ally, and your list probably will overlap a little bit, but you don't want them to overlap too much, otherwise what's the point, right? So joint actions like that can allow a couple of organizations to grow simultaneously, and they have been shown in the past to have really good cost per acquisitions. Again, assuming that you've got 2 organizations whose missions are close enough. And then other opportunities for building capacity. Staff, this may be a good time to bring on staff who have expertise in a particular field, but to build those relationships, talk about them in terms of coalitions for election year or journalists and bloggers and that kind of folks for this year. But if you become a trusted source for a journalist or a trusted ally for a coalition partner, that's the kind of thing that can last far beyond 2020. It's also a good opportunity to build expertise, like, for instance, expertise in what nonprofits can do in an election year, as we are doing today. You can also, but there may be other things. It may be a chance for one of your staff members to learn more about digital advertising, or learn more about media relations, or learn more about grassroots organizing. The kinds of things that there are going to be plenty of trainings and webinars and in-person events around all of these kind of issues over the next few months. And then, of course, any chance you have to boost your media prominence is generally considered a good idea. And finally, you can encourage people to vote. You just can't encourage them to vote for a party person, and you want to be a little cautious as you get closer to the election. But when I was at National Women's Law Center, we did 2012 campaign. We were educating our supporters about the issues day in and day out, and so when it came time to be sure to remind them to vote and to register to vote before that, we didn't have to say much. We could basically say, why, it's time to vote. So don't be shy about engaging publicly. Jean laid out the rules of the road, and I have worked for organizations that were super cautious and I think missed opportunities. Obviously, you do not need to be the one to find the new opportunity to run into trouble with the IRS, but you don't want to miss the opportunities to advance your issues and, help make the country more what you want it to look like and the world. So with that, I believe it is time to, and Jean, you know how to do the questions. That's really outside my expertise.
We actually have a couple questions, in the chat. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and then I'll just read it, and then we will, and I'll answer it. So Paul has asked to get feedback on 2 scenarios. I think I definitely understood the first scenario. I'm not 100% certain I understood the second. The first is where a national C3 group of doctors who have long advocated for healthcare want to send an identical candidate questionnaire to all 2020 candidates, and they don't plan to grade or comment on candidate responses. They intend merely to report out the answers. That would be definitely something that would be permissible with a 501c3. It's not advocating for or against any particular candidate, and is equally distributed and collected on a nonpartisan basis. So that would fall definitely in. His second scenario, I think I understand. He says this is where the same group of doctors want to ask all candidates equally for their positions related to a set of policy recommendations they've developed. Specifically, they'll be asking questions based on their personal patient stories, and then asking if the candidates will agree to take specific policy positions. This falls outside the scope of political activity, I believe, in 52072. So I think that that would be permissible, at least how it was relayed to me here.
And again, because it's nonpartisan and all candidates, and not advocating for any particular candidate or party.
Exactly. That's exactly.
It does. They will advocate for particular positions, but then when they report it out to the broader group of doctors, they won't opinionate about what kind of answers they got. Does that make sense? It's basically like they want a bird dog. But they don't want to go and bird dog in favor of a candidate. They want to bird dog in favor of a position that they've held for a long time.
Yeah, and this is, definitely falls into issue advocacy and education in that. So I wouldn't have any problem with what at least you described.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Great question. Yeah. What's next?
Let's see. Ryan asks, can a C3 distribute educational material and use it to encourage individuals to influence party or candidate platforms on those issues? As far as the policy influence, that would sounds like it'd be fine. As far as then, only you'd have to be bipartisan in how you presented it. If you were going to use the information that you received, you wouldn't be able to use it in a partisan way, depending on that. But yeah, to influence their platforms, that's perfectly acceptable. And I think I answered that one. Sound dropped. Oh, these are all when you lost. How can C3...
Oh, no.
No, it's okay. I got down to another question. How can C3 nonprofits interact with the National Political Party conventions? Well, you wouldn't be able to use money for, let's see. I'd have to think about that one a little bit.
Yeah.
There's some activity you probably could do related to it, but I don't know that you could actually... I don't even
what about
sponsor or something. I gotta be honest. I definitely would have to look that up. That's a situation where you would be using resources, financial resources, probably for a sponsorship or something. That's what I'm guessing. Related to
what if you did? Yeah, what if you did a like a happy hour or a reception?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's
but it was open to everyone.
Yeah, if it's your own event and it's something that can be accessible to anybody attending or something like that, that would be one thing. Like in the one of the hotels that's hosting people.
It'd probably be safer if you were going to do it at one convention, you do it at both.
Yeah, but as far as the actual working directly with the party at the convention through their own sponsorship program, and that, no, the C3 would not be able to do that for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Great questions, guys.
Yeah, that was good. Second scenario is about organizations supporting. I see. He was just telling us what it was. Well, that was it. Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, you have my contact information. Feel free as you're getting into this in the selection year. If anything else comes up, you can use me as a resource. I'm available 24/7 for the most part. I know I tend to wake up in the middle of the night and I'm checking my phone at 2 a.m. But I'd be happy to get back.
I think we're all kind of Yeah, I think we're all kind of doing that nowadays.
Yeah.
Welcome to
I feel like anyway.
where the work never ends. And I have to point out that Jean is also an entrepreneur who has a startup firm, so she's doubly busy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And like I said earlier, we'll be following up with more info. We'll follow up with a recording of the session, assuming everything worked right on the recording. And I think I mentioned earlier, my ebook is coming out shortly, and I'll send you all a link to get that. It's only $5, so I'll give you a link to get it for half price. But obviously, if you have questions on the legal side, please follow up with Jean. And then obviously, I do digital strategy for a living. I'm very happy to talk with, I'll talk with anybody for a few minutes, absolutely. So if you have any questions or just want to bounce some ideas around, drop me a line. And if you're in DC, let's go grab coffee or a beer or hop on the phone. But with that, I believe we can wrap things up unless there's been another question.
Nope.
Anything else, Jean?
Nope. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, folks, and we'll see you again soon. Oh, and like I mentioned earlier, if you're in DC, we're going to have a Net Squared meetup at the WeWork Wonder Bread next Wednesday at 6. And I'll be posting about that on epolitics.com and also on various listservs and such that many of you are probably on. But thank you, Jean. Thank you so much for your expertise.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.